In recent weeks, a quiet tension has settled over the heart of the Catholic Church, the kind that does not announce itself with dramatic gestures or official proclamations, but instead grows steadily through pauses, omissions, and carefully measured silence. What followed the extraordinary consistory of January 7 and 8 has revealed that sometimes the most significant movements in ecclesial life are not marked by what is declared, but by what is deliberately left unresolved. At first glance, the consistory appeared uneventful. No sweeping reforms were announced. No doctrinal earthquakes shook the Vatican. No document emerged that seemed destined to immediately alter the Church's visible direction. On the surface, it was a meeting that concluded calmly, almost routinely. Yet among cardinals, clergy, and attentive observers, a different impression began to form almost immediately after the doors closed. There was a sense that the meeting had not truly finished, that something essential had been suspended rather than settled. This gathering carried particular weight because it represented the first major collegial moment of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. It was widely seen as an early test of how his leadership would embody the ideals of shared discernment, open dialogue, and synodality so often emphasized in recent years. For significant topics were formally placed on the agenda, each deserving of serious attention. But among them, one stood apart in both sensitivity and symbolic power, the question of the Holy Mass celebrated according to the traditional Roman Rite. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. For countless Catholics across the world, this is not a peripheral issue. It touches identity, memory, reverence, and continuity. It shapes how faith is experienced and handed on. For some, the traditional Mass is a spiritual home where silence, ritual, and transcendence speak deeply to the soul. For others, it represents a pastoral challenge, raising concerns about unity, authority, and the risk of ideological division. Over recent years, this form of the liturgy has become a focal point where broader tensions within the Church converge. Many believed the consistory would finally confront this issue openly. Instead, as the sessions began, a procedural explanation was offered, time was limited, and only 2 of the 4 topics could be addressed. The liturgical question was set aside. There was no debate, no exchange of views, no word spoken publicly about it. The topic simply vanished from the floor. In any other context, such an adjustment might have seemed insignificant. Meetings often run out of time. Priorities shift. But within the Vatican, context carries immense meaning. When a highly anticipated issue is removed without discussion, the silence itself becomes eloquent. It raises the question not of what was said, but of why something was not said at all. Many present sensed that the omission was too deliberate to be accidental. It felt less like postponement and more like careful management. The true story of the consistory began after it officially ended. In the days that followed, discreet conversations began to circulate. Not rumors, but fragments of information shared cautiously among those familiar with how the Church communicates through gestures as much as through words. It emerged that something had been distributed to the cardinals at the close of the meeting. Not announced. Not discussed. Not included in the official record. According to reports later published by the Catholic Herald, this was a confidential written document, handed privately to the cardinals. Its author was identified as Cardinal Arthur Roche, prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship. The document was said to contain a markedly critical assessment of the traditional Roman Rite. This detail changed the entire atmosphere. Cardinal Roche is not a marginal figure in contemporary liturgical debates. In recent years, he has become closely associated with the implementation of restrictions following Traditionis Custodes, shaping diocesan policies and practices related to the traditional Massachusetts. His stance is well known, regardless of whether one agrees with it. That such a document would be distributed privately, precisely when the liturgical question had been excluded from public discussion, struck many as deeply significant. Here lay the core tension. Publicly, the consistory was framed as an exercise in collegiality and shared listening. Privately, one of the most sensitive issues in the Church was being addressed through a confidential evaluation authored by a leading proponent of a restrictive approach. This was not procedural neutrality. It was a striking contrast between appearance and method. For many observers, this reframed the entire event. What had seemed like an unfinished conversation now appeared more like a carefully sequenced process, where outcomes might be shaped quietly and indirectly rather than through open debate. No decision was announced, yet a direction seemed implied. No decree was issued, yet a path appeared to be outlined. This is why unease persisted. If nothing had been decided, why circulate such a document at all? And if a direction had already been discerned, why convene a consistory that avoided discussing the issue openly? The focus began to shift away from the traditional Mass itself and toward a deeper concern about how decisions are made within the Church. At stake was not merely liturgical policy, but the method of governance. The liturgy is not an administrative tool. It is the heart of Catholic life, where doctrine becomes prayer and belief takes embodied form. Treating it primarily as a technical matter to be managed through confidential documentation, while other issues are openly debated, risks widening the gap between official processes and the lived faith of believers. For many, the January consistory left something unresolved, even wounded. Not through confrontation, but through omission. Through the sense that a deeply meaningful issue had been moved into the shadows rather than brought into the light. Whether this approach will eventually become explicit remains uncertain. The direction may yet be stated openly, or it may continue to emerge through subtle signals, instructions, and permissions that speak without declaring themselves. What is clear is that what was not said continues to speak, and its voice has not faded. As time passed, the silence surrounding the consistory did not dissipate. Instead, it gained density. Attention shifted increasingly toward the confidential document and its implications. What unsettled many was not only the document's content, but how it was introduced. It was not presented as a proposal or a draft open to discussion. It arrived after deliberations had ended, at a moment when response was no longer possible. In ecclesial life, such timing matters. Documents shared after discussion do not invite dialogue, they frame understanding. They define boundaries of what is considered reasonable or problematic. If the document truly offered a sharply critical evaluation of the traditional Mass, then the issue had not merely been postponed, but relocated from open discernment to administrative assessment. This distinction proved crucial. Debate allows for plurality and mutual listening. Evaluation suggests conclusion. Yet no conclusion was publicly acknowledged. This ambiguity fostered a sense of dissonance, where official language emphasized openness while procedural signals suggested predetermined outcomes. Trust began to feel fragile, not because decisions were being made, but because the process felt opaque. Two main interpretations emerged. One viewed the document as preparatory, intended to orient the cardinals and reduce polarization before future decisions. From this perspective, excluding the topic from public debate was a strategy aimed at preserving unity. The other interpretation was more skeptical. It saw the document as evidence that a decision had already been effectively made, even if not formally announced. In this reading, silence was not neutral but functional. This tension now defines the aftermath of the consistory. The Church is not only an institution, it is a communion. Its authority depends not just on decrees, but on credibility and the perception that decisions arise from genuine listening and shared responsibility. When sensitive matters are handled indirectly, that perception weakens. The traditional Mass embodies this challenge vividly. For many, it represents continuity with centuries of faith, a language of worship that formed saints and communities long before contemporary disputes. For others, it raises legitimate concerns about unity and ecclesial obedience. These tensions are real and deserve honest, pastoral engagement. What unsettles many is not regulation itself, but the sense that such regulation may be advancing through channels that bypass shared discernment. Thus the question expands beyond liturgy. Is this ultimately about rites, or about governance? About coexistence of forms, or about how authority is exercised? These questions were not voiced publicly in the days after the consistory, but they circulated quietly in conversations and reflections among clergy and lay faithful who sensed that something important was being decided out of view. Into this charged silence came another voice. On January 8, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller offered a different interpretation in an interview. He suggested that the absence of discussion on the traditional Roman Rite should not be read as hostility, but as a matter of priorities. In his view, the Church's most urgent crises lie not in liturgical forms, but in widespread secularization, cultural indifference to Christianity, aggressive anti-Christian ideologies, and false anthropologies that undermine human dignity. Given these challenges, he argued, the limited time of the consistory may have been better spent addressing external threats rather than internal disagreements. From this perspective, the liturgical question, while important, does not carry the same urgency. His analysis was sober and intellectually coherent, and for some it offered reassurance. Yet it did not fully resolve the unease. Even if greater threats exist, the question of method remains. Should such a sensitive issue be handled indirectly, through confidential assessments, rather than openly through collegial exchange? Cardinal Müller expressed confidence that Pope Leo XIV would eventually find a balanced solution, but he placed that solution within a longer horizon, calling for patience. For some, this emphasis on patience felt wise. For others, it highlighted a growing divide between those who see the traditional Mass as a secondary concern in the face of global crises and those who experience it as a deeply personal and immediate reality. For communities attached to the traditional rite, restrictions are not abstract debates. They affect daily worship, parish life, vocations, and spiritual continuity. When their concerns appear to be addressed quietly, without visibility or voice, the sense of marginalization deepens. The January consistory thus stands at a crossroads of interpretation. Was it an act of prudent restraint or a sign of procedural imbalance? Was the silence pastoral wisdom or institutional control? The answers may not come quickly. But it is increasingly clear that what happened after the meeting may prove more significant than what happened during it. The Church moves not only through statements, but through patterns and habits, through the ways decisions are formed and communicated. Those patterns are now under close scrutiny. As the initial surprise faded, what remained was not clarity but shape, an outline of a deeper issue extending far beyond liturgical forms. At its core, this moment is about how the Church speaks to herself. About authority and trust. About whether sacred realities are discerned together in the light, or shaped quietly through administrative means. Pope Leo XIV now stands before a delicate horizon. His early choices, especially in process, will shape not only policies but tone and credibility. The Church has always lived with tensions between unity and diversity, tradition and adaptation. What is new is the heightened sensitivity to how those tensions are handled. In an age of instant communication, silence no longer disappears. It becomes visible and symbolic. And symbols matter. Whether or not the concerns surrounding this consistory are ultimately justified, the perception of distance has consequences. Trust grows through transparency. When decisions touching the heart of Catholic life seem to form away from open discernment, even well-meaning governance can feel remote. The Eucharist is not an administrative matter. It is the spiritual center of the Church. Debates surrounding it touch believers at the deepest level. Both those who find their faith nourished by the traditional Mass and those who worry about its implications deserve to be heard. When some experiences are addressed quietly while others are openly discussed, imbalance arises. Pope Leo XIV now stands before a delicate horizon. His early choices, especially in process, will shape not only policies but tone and credibility. If this moment becomes a pattern, it risks reinforcing the impression that unity is maintained through control rather than persuasion. But if it becomes a turning point, one where concerns are acknowledged and integrated, it could strengthen trust. History suggests that the Church grows strongest not by suppressing tensions, but by carrying them together. The coming months will reveal whether the liturgical question returns to open discussion or continues to surface indirectly. What is certain is that the faithful are watching with hope, longing for clarity and reverence. The January consistory did not deliver a headline. It left a question hanging in the air. How the Church chooses to answer that question will shape not only the future of a liturgical form, but the way she understands herself in a divided world. Silence can be wise, but it can also wound. And when silence begins to speak louder than words, it becomes a message whose meaning cannot be ignored. If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.